In all of human history, the faith of Elijah and Elisha stands out. Elijah rebuked kings, caused a drought, raised the dead, called down fire and rain, split the Jordan River, 16 miracles in all. Just when you thought you'd seen every miracle, God swept him up and he never tasted death. The mantle was then passed, the portion was then doubled, and Elijah's 16 became Elisha's 32. And these were just ordinary men like us.
How's everybody doing? All right. Anybody else mad that it was cold when you got up? It's like, I almost wore a shirt that looked like an Easter egg just so I could try to will spring into existence. I have one in the back, but anyway. It's purple and it's got all the pastels and everything. Anyway, so we've been talking about Elijah the last few weeks. We're going to transition. There's like 2 or 3 transitional sermons in the storyline. So where Elijah and Elisha exist in the same moment, right? They're working together. And so it gets a little confusing, just to give you a heads up, because Elisha, I'm going to mix them up today. So if you have your Bible or you have your cell phone, you're going to want to pull it out because I'm going to mix it up. You're going to want to do that for the next couple weeks. Because I'm going to mix it up and you're going to be like, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. Or you're just going to get them confused yourself, right? It happens every time. But basically, let me catch you up on the story. So you have Elijah. Elijah's a prophet, and Elijah is he's a prophet in a time when Israel has a really bad king, like just not good. You know, the guy's name's Ahab, and so Ahab is married to a crazy lady who worships this god called Baal, and so Elijah goes up to the guy, and I know we're going to review this every time, right? Just it's if you get bored, sorry, I'm just teaching Bible, like that's it. So she worships Baal. Elijah goes up to the king because basically what's happened is the kingdom of Israel at this point. So it's no longer one nation, it's 2 nations. You have Israel, the kingdom of Israel, and the kingdom of Judah. So basically what it is they had a split, right? And they split over who was going to have power after a secession. But anyway, the kingdom of Israel is not worshiping God, it's worshiping Baal. And so God's upset, and it's Elijah's job to speak for God. So he goes up to the king and he says, it's not going to rain again unless I say so. Yeah, this is an awkward moment, but things keep going forward. He's now on the king's bad side because it actually doesn't rain. And so then after that, there's a showdown with Elijah, the prophets of Baal. God shows himself. It starts to rain because Elijah and God decide that that's what's going to happen. But then Elijah's terrified. He runs off into the desert. He's suicidal. It's just this whole thing. So it's just a roller coaster ride, right? And that's kind of where we were last week. And then at the end of that whole exchange, God says to Elijah, this is where we settled in last week. At the end of that whole exchange, God says to Elijah, go back the way you came and go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael, king over Aram. Also anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, king over Israel. And anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, from Abel-Meholah, to succeed you as prophet. Jehu will put to death any who escape the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death any who escape the sword of Jehu. Yet I reserve 7,000 in the land of Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal, and whose mouths have not kissed him. So what's happening here is God's giving Elijah the next steps. And look, I know when you read it, you're like, there's a lot of killing that's happening right now. Well, 2 things. It's ancient culture, so there's that. And secondly, you also have to understand that the God, worshiping other gods is a threat to not only their long-term security in their following of God, but it's also a threat to their national identity. It's also a threat to their whole civil order, because the entirety of their culture is based on the Jewish religion. So this is actually a really big deal. This is actually, in that context, it would have actually been kind of a capital crime, like a big problem. And so anyway, God's given Elijah the marching orders and what to do next. And so that's where we're going to pick up here. But there's an interesting thing. God kind of puts it in order here for Elijah. He says, go find this guy named Hazael, then find Jehu, then find Elisha. But Elijah does something a little bit different. Elijah goes directly to find Elisha. Now, I think that because God doesn't, the scripture doesn't call it out, it's probably not a problem that he went to go get Elisha first. I just actually think it's interesting. I think it's interesting when you think about where Elijah was at and his frame of mind. Because literally, just before this, like a month before this, he's suicidal. Like he literally he walked out into the desert with nobody with him and no food and no water. Like the man had a plan. And so he now, God gives him orders to go do something, and the first thing he does is he goes to get Elisha. Because what Elisha is going to be is for a while, Elisha is going to be a servant. For a while, Elisha is going to be his follower, his protege. He's going to mentor Elisha. So what does he do? The first thing he does is he goes and he finds his friend, right? They're not friends yet, but they will be. And that's what we're going to unpack today, is literally just this 3 verses here. So we're in 1 Kings chapter 19, and we'll be on verse 19 is where we're going to start. So Elisha went from there and found Elisha. See, I did it already. Elijah went from there and found Elisha, son of Shaphat. He was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen, and he himself was driving the 12th pair. Elijah went up to him and threw his cloak around him. Elisha then left his oxen and ran after Elijah. "Let me kiss my father and mother goodbye," he said, "and then I'll come with you." "Go back," Elijah said. "What have I done to you?" So Elisha left him and went back. He took his yoke of oxen and slaughtered them. He burned the plowing equipment to cook the meat and gave it to the people, and they ate. Then he set out to follow Elijah and became his servant. Weird story, right? Like, if somebody were to take their coat off and throw it on you, you wouldn't be like, "Oh, I'll follow you." You'd be like, "You're a weirdo. What are you doing? And why does your coat stink?" Right? It's kind of what happens here. So there's a lot of different little cultural nuances that we'll have to unpack. But the first thing, verse 19, he went from there and found Elisha, son of Shaphat. He was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen, and he himself was driving the 12th pair. So that portion right there, it gives you a glimpse into Elisha's circumstances and his character. Okay, and so it's actually important to unpack. So Elisha has 12 yoke of oxen. This means he has 24 oxen that he can plow fields with. That's a lot. That's good. What you're seeing here is that Elisha is at the very least a man of some sort of means, right? He's got a life. He's got a farm. He's doing work. If there's 12 yoke of oxen, and let's just say there's 24, then that means that he's got at least 11 people working for him, right? So he's a man of means. And then the other thing you got to know is when it says he's plowing the 12th pair. So he's a man of means, but he still wants to work, right? He's not just telling everybody around him what to do. He's out in the field working it himself. This is important because it would have given people who would have heard the story, read the story back in the day, it would have given them context that now we have to, immediate context that now we have to unpack. But it's important to know these things because, number one, we need to know, it's important to know what Elisha came from because a lot of times we find it, the first point is there will never be less to lose. And see, this is why that's important, why that moment where that point that he's a man of means is important. Because our natural inclination, like the way that we'd go about this is we would be like, because what's happening here is God's calling him to do something different. God's calling him to leave his life behind. If Elisha leaves the farm and becomes a prophet, he has to give up everything. There's no other choice. There's nothing else he can do. He has to do that. If he's going to go follow Elijah, nobody's going to be able to oversee the farm. He's literally going to go from being a fairly wealthy man to being a nomad who's hated and loved, who has to say really hard things to the nation of Israel, but gets to experience some miracles. He's turning in the American dream, kind of, for a homeless life. The stories will tell he's going to be living in random people's homes. He's going to be going around. He's going to have to be this homeless dude who looks at a king and is like, "You're wrong." Right? And a lot of us, when we think about the things that God might be calling us to, we wait for there to be less to lose. We wait for the timing to be right. But see, here's the thing. We often prioritize practical timing over God's timing. Like, too often, we just think that if God called me to do this, then it'll make sense in my plan. Right? And like, come on, Elisha's plan wasn't to go from like, yeah, I'm kind of rich to like, I'm kind of homeless. Elisha's plan couldn't have been that. He wouldn't have been out in the field working. And how often do we know God's asking us to do something, but we don't, because we don't agree with his timing? Like, how often do you feel like I talk to so many people like in this church that they'll just be like, "Man, I know there's something coming. I know that God's got something for me. I can feel it coming. I just don't know what it is yet." And that's awesome. The only thing I beg, that I pray, that I hope, is that we don't get stuck on our own plan and ignore what God's called us to do in the first place. More often than not, God's timing doesn't make any sense to us, but it makes sense in hindsight. We see what he was doing, right? But why? Why do we lean on our own understanding? Why do we lean on our own plan? Why do we lean on our own timing? Why do we wait for the timing to seem right? Why do we wait for it to look practical? Because we're afraid of failing. Because we're afraid that it's not going to work. We're afraid to look like idiots. I mean, how dumb would Elisha have looked if this hadn't gone? How dumb did he probably look anyway? He had security. He had everything he could have wanted, and he went and followed this dude. Like, the queen is trying to kill him. The queen is trying to kill Elijah. He's an outlaw. He's on the run. He literally spent a month in the desert trying not to get killed. Dude comes in and goes, "Hey, I think God wants you to come with me." And Elisha goes, "All right." Like, we're afraid of looking stupid, so we don't do the things that God wants us to do. For those of you who are like super practical and are like, yeah, but I'm going to make it better in just a second. So you have he's the 12 yoke of oxen. He's driving one of the pair. Elijah walks up and he throws this cloak on Elisha. Now, that's part of the story that's kind of weird, but you probably guessed it has cultural significance. So prophets, this isn't just unique to Judaism. It is a Middle Eastern thing, because all religions had prophets or seers or whatever, just like most religions now have clergy, right? So you'll have a pastor in a Christian church, you'll have a priest in a Protestant church, you'll have a pastor, in a Catholic church, you'll have a priest. In Judaism, you have rabbi, but also there's another one that I can't remember. I should know these things, but you get the idea. It's a position, and so what would happen is these guys would wear, they call it a mantle, a cloak, whatever. It's a shawl, right? Like, it's a covering that goes over your shoulders, and a lot of times these things would be made of like leather, and then they'd have hair woven into them. So it's something that's really durable. It's going to last a long time, and it's a sign for everybody to know what they do, to know who they are, kind of thing. So it's ceremonial garb that I guess he wore every day, but you get the idea. So when Elijah comes and places his cloak onto Elisha, it's very obvious what he's saying. He's saying, "You are to come and follow me and learn to do what I do." And so that's why Elisha's immediate response is like, because I guess Elijah just like dropped that joker and turned around, because it says that Elijah went up to him, threw his cloak around him, and Elisha then left his oxen and ran after Elijah. So it was like, hey, and then just turned around, I guess. But Elisha's like, whoa, and runs after me. He's like, let me at least say goodbye to my mother and father. Like, let me at least like shut things down here. And Elijah's response is, go, what have I done to you? Right? And I was reading in commentaries this week, because sometimes you'll read something in the Bible that doesn't quite make sense, because like, if you read that from our perspective, go, what have I done to you? It's almost like Elijah's remorseful. It's almost like he's like sad. And you could see that, you could say that potentially, but also a lot of these guys are like, they believe that what Elijah is actually saying to Elisha, when you take it in context, I guess, in the Hebrew, is that what Elijah's saying is, go, what have I done to you? As in, God called you. You don't need to ask my permission to say goodbye to your mother and father. Go do what you need to do, but remember, God called you, not me, right? And so the second point here is you make a plan, right? So there's never going to be less to lose. The stakes never get better. You're always going to be afraid. But then also, like, don't be an idiot. Like, make a plan. And you're like, where do you see making a plan here with Elisha? Well, first of all, Elisha makes his plan a little bit different. I think some of us should keep the way he makes his plan in mind. Elisha goes back and he takes all of the yokes off the oxen and builds a fire. And then he has a barbecue. The plan Elisha makes is that he will never be tempted to go home and start over. Elisha's plan is to compensate for the fact that he might want to turn around. I'm not saying that everybody needs that. What I'm saying is Elisha takes the time to make a plan. His plan is just a little different, right? But if you know God's calling you to something, you got to remember there's never going to be less to lose. Your timing doesn't matter as much as God's timing, but then also you got to think through it. Elisha must have taken the time to think through what this was going to cost him, because it doesn't make sense otherwise for him to burn up all the equipment and eat the cattle. Right? It just doesn't, it's not practical. So on his walk back, he's going, okay, what do I have to do here? Okay, this is going to be really hard. Okay, I don't want to be torn. I don't want to be having to keep up the farm while I'm trying to do this. I don't want to be doing this. I don't want to put this burden on someone else. And then that's what he does, right? I mean, obviously I'm projecting. That's not all in the Bible, but you would think that that's kind of how that worked. And the way Elisha reacts to this whole thing reminds me of a story when I was, I don't know, it was probably 8 years ago now, 7 years ago now. So at the time, the church in La Plata was growing like super fast. So basically what had happened was the church outgrew the building we were in originally. If you've ever been over to our La Plata campus, at the very front, there's this building that's got a dome roof on it. That building seats about 400 people, and we were running 1,200 through it every week. And it was nuts. You know, Easter service, there'd be people sitting in the parking lot listening on speakers. It was just crazy. So then we decided to build a building. Took forever. And they finally got into the building. And the church just exploded once they got into the building. And we hit this point where there was like 2,500 people coming to church in the summer, which is like crazy, because y'all know what happens in the summer. Y'all go camping and stuff, you know? So when there's 2,500 people there in the summer, how many people are going to be there in the fall, you know? And so with all of that stuff going on, you know, we were planting churches, we were starting new churches, we were trying everything we could to take people who had been invested in the church, put them into a new church so that people who were brand new would have a place to sit, right? It's a problem that we wish we had right now, but COVID, thanks, you know. And so like that's kind of what they're doing, and so during this time period, we started talking about the video church thing, and what does that look like, and how's it going to go? And you can have your opinions on the video church thing as much as you want. You may like a live preacher better. You may like the video okay. You may be willing. You may not care, right? But we were talking about it because, look, it's easier to start a church that way because you ain't got to find somebody who can preach. Like here, that wasn't the case. Curtis could preach. But like you have sometimes, it's just easier to start churches that way. So we're like, hey, let's figure it out. Let's try it. Let's go. And I remember in this whole process talking with my dad through it because in my mind, I'm just logical. And I was like 23 and I didn't experience any of the pressures that he had experienced. I didn't have any of the perspective he had had. And I just would be like, Dad, why don't we do this? Like, let's just go do this. Let's go do this. And if you're not familiar, my dad's a pastor over there. And so I was like, let's just do it. Let's just do it. Let's just do it. And finally, we're walking around in the sanctuary one day. And I'm like, hey, he's like, yeah, I think we're doing the video thing. I'm like, what took so long? What took you so long to decide to do that? And his answer was something I will never forget. He said, every time we come on one of these moments where I feel like God's calling me to do something a little bit different, it just takes me some time. I said, well, why? He said, I have to figure out whether or not I'm willing to be the man that's going to take every time. And then he turned and he looked at me and said, and I know that I probably should just say yes immediately. But I always have to count the cost. And the thing that I loved about that moment is the tension. Because, and honestly, no, the thing that I love now about that moment is the tension. At the time, the lesson I took from it is like, say yes faster. Every time, only say yes. There's a problem with that, which is sometimes you're wrong and it wasn't God, it was just you. And then you dive head first into a pile of poo, Like, I've done that a few times. With a little more time and experience, I've come to love the tension. Because look, he walks into that conversation knowing the answer is yes. Like, he didn't say that in our conversation, but I've known my dad my whole life, right? He walks into that conversation knowing the answer is yes. But he has to unpack who he's going to have to become to be that. That's what I mean by make a plan. If you know God's calling you to something, you don't have a choice. If you know God's pushing you into something, I keep using the word calling, right? What I need you to hear, if you're from the church world, is that when I say calling, I'm not always just saying the big picture life mission. Like sometimes God's asking you to do something small, right? Sometimes he's calling you to do something small. So like, don't overblow it. Don't make it too complicated. If you know God's asking you to do something, the answer should always be yes. But to the degree that it's going to affect your life, you should also count the cost. Because if you don't count the cost, you may get into it and be upset. You may get into it and it may be too hard. You may get into it and it may surprise you. It may mess you up. And then now you're in the midst of it and you're ready to quit. You should always count the cost. So we have to know that there'll never be less to lose. We got to make a plan. And then we have to do whatever it takes. The last sentence says he left to go be Elijah's servant. He left to go be Elijah's servant. This is a man of means. This is a man who led people. This is a man who had multiple employees. He burned it all down. And he went to go pour hands on the water of Elijah. God's plan is not always going to make you the hero of the story. What God's calling you to do isn't always going to be glamorous. What God's asking you to do is not always going to be what you want it to be. But doing what he asks is always the best outcome. Doing what he asks, you may not always get to do what you want to do, but if you do what he asks, you will always become who you were supposed to become, right? And so that's what Elisha goes and does. And you've seen in the bumper video, they talk about, Elijah's 16 miracles, Elisha's 32. Elijah does go on, we'll talk more about it, but Elijah does go on to become even greater, even bigger, do even more. But he starts by washing his master's hands. So one of my favorite historical figures ever is this guy named Winston Churchill. There's been a couple like biographic movies come out about him and stuff like that lately. I've probably read, the only person I probably read more about is Jesus, right, than Churchill. I find Churchill fascinating. But, and I'm going to tell the story, and if you're into history, you'll go, well, Churchill wasn't a religious guy. Up front, let me just say, Winston Churchill was not a religious guy. But just because you're not a religious person doesn't mean that God's not going to use you in big ways. And I think that the story is important this way. So Churchill he was born to nobility, English nobility. Now, he's born in the late 1800s, the English nobility. So it's starting to matter less and less, right? The Victorian age is starting to come to a close. The British Empire is starting to shrink. And Churchill's a young man. During the Boer Wars down in South Africa. If I'm boring you, I'm sorry, I'll get better in a second. So then World War I comes along, and Churchill's worked his way up in government. He didn't have any noble titles because his oldest brother got those. So he's working his way up in government. He's a member of parliament. And then he ends up in the cabinet, in the official government, working, I believe, with the Lord of the Admiralty, so that would have been the Department of the Navy. And during World War II, that's where he's working. And they have this idea, this plan, where they're going to basically come in the Mediterranean Sea, come up through basically try to come in the back door on the German army. And the plan should work, and it should be like the surprise attack, and it should be amazing. And it's one of these grand strategic things, and Churchill believes that it's just going to be awesome. And they go to do the plan, and it falls completely apart. And Churchill becomes a laughingstock. He becomes a nobody. It gets to the point where he loses all of his titles, and he's traveling the world speaking to make money. But the whole time, Churchill believes that he's supposed to be prime minister. He believes he's supposed to be the man. He believes that he is supposed to lead. And he never gives up on that. But at the same time, he goes from being like somebody to nobody to laughingstock to kind of somebody. And then you get to the beginnings of World War II, the mid to late 30s. And Churchill's yelling and screaming about Hitler. He's the only one in the British Parliament who's really upset about this stuff with Hitler. He's making a big deal about all of this. And during this time, the current prime minister, his name's Neville Chamberlain, he's doing, they call it appeasement. So basically Hitler asks for something, they give it to him. He asks for something else, they give it to him. And nobody's willing to fight because they just got out of World War I. Millions of people had died. Nobody wanted to fight. Nobody wanted to do anything. And meanwhile, Churchill's making speeches, losing his mind. This is going to be bad. And then the Germans just run roughshod over France. France couldn't even hold them up. The Blitzkrieg, right? And they end up pushing the British Expeditionary Forces all the way to the sea. And you had Dunkirk. And at Dunkirk, they end up evacuating the British Expeditionary Forces with people's personal boats. That's how off guard everybody was caught. And that's how poorly everybody was supplied. They literally evacuated an army in leisure boats and fishing boats. So then you get to the famous speech. Churchill's become prime minister, all of that, and you get to the famous speech. We'll fight on the beaches. We'll fight in the hills. We'll never surrender, right? That moment They had a movie come out about all that recently. That moment is a defining moment in world history. You can listen to the audio of it. I think you can even watch video of it. It's a defining moment in world history because in that moment, this man stood as the defense against the Nazi empire, and he stood alone. And not only that, not only did he stand alone, not only was he the only one willing to speak up, he had just evacuated most of his army on fishing boats. And he said, we'll never surrender. They can invade our island, but we will fight every day, and they will have to kill all of us, right? What does this have to do with Elijah and Elisha? The biggest problem we have when it comes to doing the things that God's asked us to do is that we believe it should be easy. How many times have you gotten into something that you prayed about, you thought over, you're like, man, I really think that this is what I'm supposed to do. You get into it, and it gets hard, and doors start closing, and you're like, well, I guess God didn't want me to do that, and you just gave up. How many things have you let go because easiness was a big part of your plan? Easy is not part of God's plan. Winston Churchill was able to stand in that moment, and I believe he was able to stand in that moment with the voice of God resonating through him, whether he was a churchgoer or not. Why? Because God had kept him in the right places and put him in the right places for the right times. The man could have given up. He should have given up. We all would have given up. He went from being a big deal to getting hit by a car in the U.S. and laying in a hospital bed by himself in debt, having to ask people for money to keep his house open. But he stood through it, and he was able to stand in that moment. And even that moment, a lot of us would give up, because in that moment, everybody's beaten. The French are defeated. The Italians have jumped onto the German side. Everybody, it's this one short little fat dude who chews on cigars and drinks brandy all the time. Who the heck is he to do that? And not to mention, it's going to be really hard. Can you imagine, okay, if instead we replace those thoughts, that speech, with the way that Christians usually talk to each other? Well, it seems like God's closed the doors. Maybe there's just another plan. Maybe there's just another person. Maybe there's just a better time. Seems like God's closing the doors. God didn't promise open doors. When God called Elisha, he didn't promise him another 12 yoke of oxen. And when God called Elisha, he didn't promise him it would be easy. When God called Elisha to follow Elijah, he called him to walk in the footsteps of a criminal. He called him to be a man of weakness who called out kings and queens. We've lost our faith. We only believe in a God who can do easy things. We only believe in a God who can do easy things. And you're like, no, Robert, that's not true. I believe in a God who can do big things. Well, then why do you ask him to make everything so easy? Why do you give up when it gets a little hard? I'm not trying to be mean. I had that moment this week. I was driving down the road, and I'm just like, this week was nuts. And it wasn't church stuff. It was just other stuff that we were working on, and it got really crazy this week. And like, I had a couple days. I didn't get home until like 11 o'clock. It was stupid. And I'm like, man, I just want to see my kids, and this sucks, and I don't want to do it, and I'm tired, and I Like, maybe God's not in this. And I'm driving down the road, and it just hit me. You think God can't do hard stuff? Like, you think it's supposed to always be easy? Let me just say this. I have failed more than anybody I know. And I'm not trying to be fake humble. Like, I've failed more than anybody I know. And I've thought about this a lot lately. Why is it that you can fail this much, but God can still move? God still does stuff. Why is it that you get it wrong so many times? Like, if I'm just being honest with you, like, I'm not sure that I'm better than 50-50 discerning what God wants from me. Right? Like, I'm really not. I'm way too fast to jump. I'm way too fast to move. I'm still way too fast to be like, yeah, let's go. Right? And God's like, maybe that's not what I meant. And I always find myself in these moments where it's too hard and it's not easy, and you're just, this is the wall, this is my head, and I'm just doing this. And maybe that doesn't make me a great example, and that's all good. I guess I'm just testifying at the moment. Like, I would rather bang my head against the wall trying to move in what God's called me to do than stand there frozen and never do anything. And this is what I've learned. When I jump, even if I jump too quickly, he always fixes it. And I think it's because he's just honoring the faith. I think he's just honoring the faith. And so when I'm having those thoughts, thinking about everything, and then I had that moment in the car this week of just like, what? This is so hard. I just was reaffirmed, and it's kind of cool that the sermon was this week, but just reaffirmed in this. I wrote it down. Let me just say it. God didn't ask you for easy. He asked you to matter. And things that matter don't come easy. There's something that God's asked you to do, or there will be something God will ask you to do. And it won't make any sense. And it'll look too hard. And you may get in the middle of it and it might get hard. And you may think, maybe he didn't ask me to do this. I'm not here to discern for you. I can't do that. You have to learn how to do that yourself. But what I will say is, life is better when you jump. Because if you never jump, you'll never experience him catching you. He's asked you to matter. And things that matter don't come easy. Can I pray with you? God, first of all, I pray that you would help each one of us with discernment. I pray that we would have faith to do crazy stuff for you. But Lord, I pray that you'd give us each wisdom to discern well. Lord, let us do the things that we're afraid of doing. Let us do the things that are hard. Let us do the things that we know you've been asking us to do, but we don't think we've been putting it off because of the timing isn't right. God, let us do those things. Let us step in faith. Let us step in faith knowing that if we mess it up, you'll catch us anyway. God, honestly, the biggest thing is I just pray that we would be a bold people. And that we would be a bold people who's not afraid of failing. And that when we fail, we would say, you know what? That was me. I messed that up. And when we succeed, we would say, look at what God did. Lord, I just pray that we give you the glory. And I pray that you'd give us the discernment, the boldness, the courage to be the people you created.